The courtroom was silent. Not the polite hush of civility or the quiet murmur of anticipation. This was a suffocating silence that gripped everyone in the room, the kind that made your chest tighten, your pulse quicken, and your stomach knot. At the center of it stood a man in a blue anti-suicide vest, his face obscured by a beard, his eyes hidden behind the shadow of exhaustion and despair. That man was Nick Reiner, 32 years old, the son of Hollywood director Rob Reiner and photographer-producer Michelle Reiner. He looked like someone trying to vanish from the world, yet everyone was staring. Every camera, every journalist, every public eye trained on him, yet he barely moved, barely spoke. Only 6 words escaped him. "Yes, Your Honor," as he agreed to the next court date. 6 words. No emotion, no explanation. But in those 6 words, an entire story, a nightmare story, was encapsulated. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. How does a family, a Hollywood dynasty, descend into something so unthinkable? How does fame, wealth, and public adoration dissolve into a crime scene and a courtroom drama that will haunt Los Angeles for years? These are the questions we must grapple with. Not because we want the answers. Those will emerge slowly, painfully, and in fragments. But because the truth, as horrifying as it is, matters. And it matters now. The story begins in Brentwood, one of the most affluent and serene neighborhoods in Los Angeles, known for its manicured lawns, quiet streets, and high-profile residents. It was early Sunday morning when police responded to a 911 call that would forever mark the neighborhood. Rob Reiner, 78, celebrated for his contributions to film and television, and Michelle Reiner, 70, a respected photographer and producer, were found dead in their home. Both victims had suffered multiple stab wounds. The discovery was shocking enough, but what followed would shock the world even more. Their own son was accused of the crime. 3 days later, Nick Reiner appeared in court. The image was seared into the collective memory of anyone following the case. He was bearded, disheveled, wearing a blue anti-suicide smock that immediately signaled a level of precaution more often reserved for the most dangerous or emotionally volatile defendants. To the outside observer, he looked fragile, vulnerable, yet dangerous in a way that made everyone recoil. And he did not speak, except to confirm the next hearing date. The courtroom held its breath. The media held its breath. And a city known for its fascination with celebrity scandal prepared itself for a story that would unravel in shocking, unpredictable ways. But let's pause for a moment. This is not a story about Hollywood gossip or sensational headlines. It's a story about betrayal, about the darkest recesses of the human mind, about family dynamics that can collapse under pressure and fear. It's about a son standing accused of killing his parents, a father he had worked with, a mother he had loved, inside the home where he was raised. And it's about the silent questions that hover over every detail. What drove him to this? Was it rage, resentment, mental instability, or something even more sinister? Or is the truth far more complicated than the courtroom allows us to see? Consider this. Nick Reiner, by all appearances, had the world at his fingertips. Born into privilege, surrounded by fame, money, and opportunity, he was a figure who could have chosen any path. Yet, on that early Sunday morning, everything changed. The home that had once been a sanctuary became a crime scene. The lives of 2 remarkable individuals were snatched away in an instant, leaving behind unanswered questions, grief, and disbelief. And the person accused, the son, the family member, the one who should have been closest, was now the center of scrutiny, speculation, and legal proceedings that would unfold for months, if not years. In that moment, the contrast between public perception and private reality became glaringly apparent. The Reiners were a family admired by millions, their work celebrated across generations, their contributions to the arts monumental. And yet, behind closed doors, something had shifted, something tragic, violent, and irreversible. It is a stark reminder that no amount of wealth, fame, or accomplishment can shield a family from the storms that sometimes rage within. The courtroom appearance itself was a study in contradictions. Nick Reiner, charged with a crime that no parent should ever imagine, yet physically restrained for his own safety. A man accused of murder, yet clothed in protection against suicide. Silence was both his shield and his statement. The weight of every gaze in the room pressed down on him, the whispers of journalists, the clicking of cameras, the low murmur of anticipation, all creating a crucible in which the accused had no choice but to stand, waiting for a legal system that would decide his fate, or at least the immediate procedural next steps. And the public watched. Social media exploded with speculation. News outlets churned out stories at a feverish pace. Experts weighed in on motives, psychological profiles, and possible outcomes. But for all the analysis and conjecture, the reality remained painfully simple. A family was gone, and a son stood accused of their murder. The stakes were clear, but the full story, what truly happened in those early morning hours, was hidden behind the layers of investigation, legal maneuvering, and silence. This is where our exploration begins, not with the crime itself, not with speculation, but with the aftermath. The descent of a man into legal and public hell. The unraveling of a family legacy. The ripple effects of tragedy that reach far beyond the walls of a single home. Because this is not just a case about violence. It is about consequence, perception, and the fragile threads that hold even the most successful families together. As we move forward, it is crucial to ask ourselves, what drives a person to commit an act that shatters every expectation, every familial bond, every societal norm? Is it anger, jealousy, mental illness, or a combination of forces too complex to neatly categorize? And when the accused is a son of fame, someone who carries the weight of legacy, how do we reconcile admiration with horror? These are questions we will explore, piece by piece, as the story unfolds. But before we go there, consider the atmosphere in that courtroom. The silence, the tension, the cameras capturing every twitch, every glance, every micro-expression. This was a stage, but it was also a crucible. Every movement was scrutinized, every pause interpreted. And in the middle of it all stood Nick Reiner, a man who had gone from son to suspect, from family member to public spectacle, in the span of a few days. His future, his freedom, and the truth of what happened rested in a room filled with strangers, officials, and the gaze of a city unwilling to look away. The story we are about to tell is not easy. It is not comfortable. It is filled with contradictions, with moments that defy explanation, and with a human tragedy that reverberates far beyond Los Angeles. And yet, it is a story that must be told, not to sensationalize, but to understand the complexity of human behavior, the fragility of family bonds, and the relentless gaze of public scrutiny. So, as we begin this journey, keep in mind the words that set the stage. Yes, Your Honor. 6 words that signaled agreement, compliance, but also resignation. 6 words that marked the beginning of a descent into a courtroom drama that would shock Hollywood, bewilder the public, and haunt everyone involved. And as we delve deeper, remember this: every fact, every testimony, every revelation will bring us closer to understanding not just what happened, but how a life once full of promise could collapse into chaos in the blink of an eye. And yet, the most chilling aspect of all remains. Even now, in these opening moments, the full scope of the story is not yet revealed. The most startling revelations, the twists that no one could anticipate, are still to come. The image of a son standing accused, silent and restrained, is only the beginning. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the clerk called his name, the air in the courtroom shifted. Not subtly, not like a gentle breeze, but like a sudden gust that rattled everything in its path. Nick Reiner. Just 2 words, yet they carried weight far beyond the syllables themselves. For the people seated in the room, journalists, court officials, law enforcement, and even a handful of onlookers, the name wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. Hollywood royalty. The son of Rob Reiner, the celebrated director whose films had shaped generations, and Michelle Reiner, a photographer whose work captured the elegance and intimacy of life in ways few could. But now, that name wasn't attached to red carpets, awards, or cinematic genius. It was attached to murder. It was a jarring contradiction, one that made people blink and question what they were seeing. The man who stepped forward looked nothing like the carefully curated image of a Hollywood heir. He was bearded, his hair unkempt, eyes hollow, clad in a blue anti-suicide vest, a garment that symbolized danger, desperation, and the legal system's concern for his well-being. He moved with an awkward deliberateness, as if the very act of walking into the courtroom demanded energy he did not have. The cameras clicked incessantly, flashes piercing the sterile light of the room, capturing every nuance of his presence. Each shutter echoed like a heartbeat in the tense silence. For Nick, this was the first time standing in public since the arrest. 3 days had passed since police handcuffed him and charged him with a crime that seemed inconceivable. One day, he was a son, a brother, a member of a famous family. The next, he was accused of fatally stabbing his parents, a crime that had shaken Brentwood to its foundations. The weight of that accusation bore down on him visibly. He spoke only once, a quiet but firm acknowledgement of the next court date. "Yes, Your Honor." 6 words. Sparse, almost mechanical. Yet in those 6 words lay a universe of tension, guilt, fear, and uncertainty. The courtroom itself became a theater of contrasts. On one side, the public, hungry for information, dissecting every movement, expression, and pause. On the other, legal professionals, attempting to maintain decorum, aware that this case would dominate headlines, debates, and social media feeds for weeks. And in the center, a man who had gone from being part of Hollywood's inner circle to standing in a courtroom as the accused, a figure both tragic and terrifying. Observers could not ignore the symbolism of the blue protective vest. In many ways, it was a visual representation of the precarious line between guilt and vulnerability. It suggested a person capable of self-harm, or at least a person whom authorities deemed at high risk. And that risk added an extra layer of drama to the proceedings. It was not just the alleged crime that made this appearance shocking. It was the visual evidence that the accused was fragile, desperate, and in danger even from himself. There was also the matter of his demeanor. Unlike many accused individuals who assert innocence vocally, who attempt to present themselves as rational and composed, Nick's silence was striking. His posture, his gaze, and the almost mechanical tone of his words created a disconnect between him and the world around him. The courtroom, buzzing with expectation, seemed almost to shrink in the presence of that quiet. People leaned forward in their seats, waiting for some hint, some signal, some crack in the facade that might offer insight into the man and the alleged acts he stood accused of. Yet even in this charged atmosphere, the human element could not be ignored. There was fear, yes, but also sorrow. The loss of Rob and Michelle Reiner was not just a headline. It was a human tragedy. The parents were gone, and the son, the very person expected to love and protect them, was now a figure of scrutiny. How does a family navigate such an impossible rupture? What does it feel like for extended family members, friends, and colleagues who once saw Nick as a loved one, now grappling with the reality of these allegations? Those questions hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, like smoke from a fire that had scorched everything it touched. Journalists in the room murmured among themselves, dissecting every detail. Some speculated about motive. Others focused on mental health, public perception, or the legal implications of appearing in a protective vest. Meanwhile, social media outside exploded. News outlets flashed the image of Nick standing silently, vested, bearded, alone against the stark backdrop of the courtroom. Within minutes, opinions, accusations, and shock cascaded across platforms. The public, as always, had their verdict ready. But the truth, as always, remained elusive. The media's fascination was understandable, but also dangerous. In the rush to report, nuance often fell by the wayside. The story was complex. A family, a son, allegations, procedural nuances, and the slow unfolding of a case that would stretch over months. Yet the image of Nick in that courtroom became shorthand for the entire tragedy, a symbol of a family imploding, of a life upended, and of the public's insatiable curiosity about the private lives of the famous. Even as observers focused on Nick, the underlying tragedy of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths could not be ignored. A father who had spent decades shaping culture, a mother who had captured life's beauty through her lens, both allegedly gone at the hands of their own child. The contrast was almost cinematic in its cruelty, a narrative that seemed ripped from a psychological thriller. But this was not fiction. The blood had been real, the grief palpable, and the consequences irreversible. Courtroom protocols added another layer of tension. Nick's appearance was procedural, yet every detail was scrutinized. The way he responded, the tone of his voice, the timbre of his nods, all became fodder for analysis. Even the delay of his plea, scheduled for January 7th, fueled speculation. The public wondered, why not speak? Why not defend himself immediately? Was this an admission, a strategy, or something else entirely? In this environment, every silence was interpreted as a statement. Every glance, a confession. And the truth? The truth remained tightly sealed behind legal barriers, invisible to the audience clamoring for answers. The symbolism of the courtroom went further. Here was a man whose life had once been defined by privilege and opportunity, now physically constrained and under constant observation. Each motion, each reaction, was measured and assessed. He had entered the public eye as a Reiner, a member of a revered family. Now, he stood as an accused son, stripped of status, confronted with the possibility that his future, and perhaps his freedom, hung by a thread. What made this moment especially haunting was its universality. Beyond the fame, beyond the Hollywood backdrop, this was a story about family, trust, and the potential for tragedy within households everywhere. How does a parent protect against the unimaginable? How does a sibling reconcile love with horror? These questions resonate beyond the spectacle of celebrity, striking at the core of what it means to be human. As the court proceedings continued, Nick remained largely silent. The blue vest, the quiet responses, the tense posture, all conveyed a man at the crossroads of despair and defense, isolation and scrutiny. The public saw him, yes, but understanding remained elusive. Every eye in the room was searching for an explanation, a clue, a window into his mind, but the silence persisted. That silence, heavy and suffocating, became a character in itself, a presence as palpable as any person in the room. And yet, there was more to come. What occurred during that initial appearance was only the beginning. The courtroom, though silent now, would soon be the stage for revelations, allegations, and details that would shock even seasoned observers. Evidence, timelines, and testimonies would slowly emerge, each layer peeling back a bit more of the human drama at the heart of the case. And each revelation would bring new questions, new horrors, new ethical dilemmas, and new shocks to a public already reeling. The first appearance set the tone, a mixture of tension, tragedy, and anticipation. It made clear that this story would not be a simple narrative of guilt and innocence, but a labyrinthine journey into family dynamics, public perception, and the intersection of fame and catastrophe. The name, Nick Reiner, had frozen the room, but the room, and the world, was only beginning to grasp the full weight of what it represented. And as observers left the courtroom that day, many carrying their own judgments, their own questions, and their own disbelief, one fact remained undeniable: nothing would ever be the same again. What happened next, the details of evidence and revelation, would test every assumption, challenge every perception, and slowly unveil the full scope of a tragedy that seemed almost too horrifying to comprehend. In one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, a quiet street lined with palm trees and sprawling estates held a secret that would shatter its serene facade. Brentwood is the kind of place where neighbors wave over white picket fences, where early morning jogs and dog walks are routine, and where security and privacy are highly valued. It is, in every sense, a sanctuary from the chaos of Hollywood. Yet, on that fateful early Sunday morning, the veneer of tranquility was pierced. Behind the gates of a stately home, the unimaginable had unfolded. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Reiner, 70, were dead, and the allegations surrounding their son, Nick Reiner, would turn this idyllic street into a scene of shock, fear, and speculation. The house itself was emblematic of Brentwood affluence, pristine, immaculately maintained, and filled with the trappings of a life lived in the public eye yet with deliberate privacy. Law enforcement described the scene as chaotic, yet eerily controlled. Police tape cordoned off the property, flashing lights reflected off polished windows, and the air was thick with the presence of both sorrow and investigation. Inside, the house bore the signs of a sudden and violent disruption. It was a home where art, family, and memory converged. And yet, in those quiet hours, it became the stage for tragedy. Neighbors would later describe the scene with disbelief. Some reported hearing nothing unusual, no screams, no disturbance, until the discovery of the bodies later that afternoon. Others recalled subtle disturbances, a door left ajar, an unfamiliar vehicle parked briefly, the sense that something was off. It was these small, almost imperceptible details that would come under scrutiny as investigators pieced together the timeline of the early morning. The timeline itself remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case. According to law enforcement sources, the alleged events took place in the hours before sunrise, a time when even the most attentive neighborhoods are quiet. In the solitude of night, the home was transformed from a private sanctuary into a crime scene. The discovery of the bodies later that day, by whom, remains unclear in reports, set off a cascade of emergency responses. Paramedics, detectives, and forensic teams descended on the property, all working to understand what had transpired and to preserve evidence that might one day explain the unthinkable. Yet, as dramatic as the scene was, the most haunting element was the domestic intimacy shattered in an instant. This was not a crime of strangers. It was an alleged act within the heart of a family home. The contrast between the warmth, art, and life that had filled the Reiners' home and the violence that allegedly erupted there is almost cinematic in its cruelty. It is the kind of stark contradiction that makes a story linger in the mind. A space that once symbolized safety and love became, in a single night, a space of loss, grief, and suspicion. Details about the house's layout and its contents would later prove relevant. Rob and Michelle Reiner were collectors and curators of both art and memory, their home filled with photographs, film memorabilia, and personal treasures. Every room told a story. Every photograph captured a moment of life, now forever frozen. And yet, in the chaos of what investigators would later describe, these symbols of life and achievement were overshadowed by the events that had transpired. Each artifact, each photograph, became a silent witness to a tragedy that no one could yet fully understand. Law enforcement focused on reconstructing the hours leading up to the discovery. Entry points were examined, surfaces analyzed for DNA, fingerprints, and other traces. Neighbors were interviewed, surveillance footage combed through, and even minor details became critical in understanding the chain of events. The precision with which investigators conducted their work contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos that had swept through the home and the neighborhood. In the midst of grief, the mechanics of evidence collection offered a cold but necessary clarity. But while investigators worked, the narrative outside the house began to take shape. Media outlets flooded social platforms with breaking news alerts, images of police tape, and reports of a Hollywood family torn apart. Journalists speculated about motive, mental state, and family dynamics. Public curiosity and shock mingled with sorrow, creating a tense, almost voyeuristic atmosphere that would only intensify in the days to come. Inside the home, the evidence told a story of its own. Police reports, though not fully released to the public, indicated that both Rob and Michelle Reiner had suffered multiple stab wounds, consistent with a violent and personal attack. There were no signs of forced entry, which suggested that the perpetrator, allegedly Nick, was known to the victims and had access. Every detail pointed to intimacy, familiarity, and the tragic collapse of trust. The forensic reality clashed brutally with the public perception of Hollywood families as untouchable or insulated from such horrors. The juxtaposition of normalcy and catastrophe is part of what makes this case so compelling and so horrifying. Brentwood, with its manicured lawns and quiet streets, is not typically associated with violence, especially not violence of this intimate and personal nature. The public, when imagining crime in Los Angeles, often envisions the gritty urban landscape, gang-related incidents, or high-speed chases. Rarely does one consider the possibility that the very children of famous families could be accused of murdering their own parents in their own homes. This contrast amplifies the shock and heightens the narrative tension surrounding the case. And then there was the matter of timing. The discovery of the bodies occurred hours after the alleged events, a gap that allowed for speculation, panic, and the development of theories. Had someone noticed something unusual earlier? Were there signs that could have prevented the tragedy? Or was this a perfect storm of private conflict, mental health struggles, and explosive anger that no one could have foreseen? Investigators, armed with forensic tools and procedural rigor, worked to answer these questions, but the emotional weight of the scenario remained stubbornly resistant to easy resolution. Neighbors, too, were caught between disbelief and fear. Some had known the family for years, admiring their work, attending events, and respecting their privacy. For them, the alleged crime was not just a headline. It was a breach of the social contract, a violation of trust that left a neighborhood unsettled. Security measures were discussed, gates reinforced, and the sense of safety that had once defined Brentwood seemed suddenly fragile. The Reiners' home, once a place of warmth and life, became a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances can change. Media coverage amplified the tension. Photographs of the house, police vehicles, and news crews created a visual narrative of intrusion, chaos, and curiosity. Social media users debated motives, speculated on timelines, and even questioned the behavior of those involved. Rumors spread, some informed, some entirely fabricated, reflecting the human desire to make sense of events that defy comprehension. This digital frenzy added pressure to investigators, attorneys, and the family alike, turning the private tragedy into a public spectacle. Yet, amidst the media storm, the human tragedy remained. Rob and Michelle Reiner were not just victims. They were individuals with lives, relationships, achievements, and stories now abruptly ended. Their deaths were final, brutal, and irrevocable. The alleged perpetrator, Nick Reiner, was not just a suspect. He was a son, a brother, and a figure caught between legal scrutiny and personal torment. The dynamics of love, loyalty, and betrayal became impossible to ignore, forming the emotional core of the case. For investigators, every detail mattered. The precise location of wounds, the sequence of events, and the timeline of interactions all became crucial pieces of a puzzle that might one day explain what had happened in the Reiners' home. Each room, each piece of furniture, each photograph and personal item could potentially offer insight. The house, once a sanctuary, became a repository of evidence, a silent witness to events that would forever remain tragic. And yet, even with all this, the public's fascination only grew. The story had all the elements of a psychological thriller: wealth, fame, betrayal, family violence, and mystery. Every day brought new headlines, new speculation, and new questions. The image of the Brentwood home, quiet, pristine, and now forever associated with tragedy, would linger in public consciousness, a symbol of the fragility of even the most carefully constructed lives. But what investigators would uncover in the following hours, the minute details of evidence and testimony, would begin to reveal a complexity far greater than anyone anticipated. The house was not just a scene. It was a character in the story, holding secrets, contradictions, and insights into a tragedy that had shaken both a family and a city. And as the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear the narrative of that early Sunday morning was only the surface. Beneath it lay a labyrinth of relationships, choices, and events that no one outside the home could fully comprehend. And just when it seemed that the story of the Brentwood home had reached its peak of horror, investigators would uncover evidence suggesting that the morning's events were only the beginning of a descent into chaos that would engulf the Reiner family and grip the public's attention. The quiet, serene neighborhood would never be the same. The story of a family's fall from normalcy into tragedy would continue to unfold, revealing details that were more shocking than anyone could have imagined. It is one of the most uncomfortable and unsettling truths about crime. Sometimes, the perpetrator is not a stranger, not an intruder, not a random presence in the night. Sometimes, it is the person closest to the victims, the one you trust most, the one whose face you have seen every morning for years. That is the lens through which law enforcement immediately viewed the Reiner case. From the very beginning, suspicion did not fall on a burglar, a neighbor, or a random criminal. It fell squarely on the family itself. And at the center of that suspicion was Nick Reiner, the son of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Nick, 32, was the only child in a family that had lived under the public eye for decades. Born into privilege and fame, he had grown up in Los Angeles, surrounded by the trappings of Hollywood success and the privileges that come with being a Reiner. Yet, with privilege comes scrutiny, and with opportunity comes expectation. Friends and acquaintances described him as intelligent, quiet, sometimes withdrawn. Some said he was deeply devoted to his parents. Others hinted at tension, at arguments, at a relationship that had frayed over time. The investigators' initial challenge was simple in concept, but complex in execution. They needed to determine who had access, who had motive, and who had opportunity. In the case of a locked, affluent home with no signs of forced entry, the pool of suspects narrowed quickly. Nick had keys. Nick knew the house. Nick had been there countless times. The logic, while not definitive proof, was clear. The person who had the easiest access was the person with the strongest connection to the victims. And in a tragic twist of fate, that person was their own son. Public perception played a role even before investigators made a formal statement. The image of a child turning against his parents is one that shocks the moral sensibilities of society. Hollywood had seen family drama play out on screens, but rarely does art imitate life so darkly. The notion that Nick could have been involved triggered an immediate media frenzy. Headlines screamed allegations. Social media buzzed with speculation. Podcasts dissected every possible motive. People wanted to understand how a child could allegedly commit such an act, yet in the process, they often overlooked the complex emotional, psychological, and familial dynamics at play. As police conducted their interviews and canvassed the neighborhood, patterns began to emerge. Friends described Nick as reserved but capable of intense moods. Family acquaintances hinted at financial tensions, disagreements, and moments of conflict. Ordinary enough in many households, but amplified in a family under public scrutiny. Investigators, trained to detect inconsistencies and behavioral red flags, began to focus more closely. The interviews were meticulous, the observations methodical. Every movement, every statement, every hesitation was cataloged and analyzed. Yet, what made Nick particularly complicated as a suspect was the mixture of access and intimacy. He was not only physically close to the crime scene. He was emotionally embedded in the lives of his parents. Motive is rarely simple, but opportunity and access were undeniable. The home was his home. The keys were his keys. The family that trusted him implicitly was now embroiled in suspicion. And in that tension lay the seeds of public fascination. It is one thing to hear of a violent act committed by a stranger. It is another to confront the idea that the person accused is someone you have known, perhaps even admired. Investigators had to work quickly to preserve evidence, understand timelines, and determine the sequence of events. From what could be gathered in those first crucial hours, Nick had been in the house during the time of the alleged crime. Forensic teams cataloged everything: fingerprints, DNA, the position of objects, the signs of struggle. Every detail became a potential piece of the puzzle. And as the investigation deepened, every anomaly, every minor discrepancy, every gap in memory was treated as significant. In cases where the suspect is a family member, the stakes are higher and the psychological dimensions far more intricate. The media, of course, seized on this narrative. Every report highlighted the shocking betrayal: a son, a Reiner, accused of killing his parents. The public was captivated, horrified, and incredulous all at once. Commentators debated motives endlessly. Was it financial tension? Emotional instability? A breaking point in a relationship that had been simmering for years? No one could say definitively, and that uncertainty only fueled the fire. The court of public opinion rarely waits for evidence. It forms judgments on fragments, conjecture, and the drama of human fascination. Family dynamics, as investigators would later note, are rarely straightforward. Even in families that appear harmonious, tensions can simmer under the surface, often invisible to outsiders. Nick's relationship with his parents, according to some close to the family, was complicated. There were moments of closeness and care, but also moments of disagreement, distance, and unspoken strain. In ordinary households, such tensions might be benign or fleeting. In this case, tragically, they became part of a narrative that law enforcement had to consider carefully. And yet, while investigators focused on facts, the human element loomed large. For extended family, friends, and even neighbors, the notion that Nick could be involved was unbearable. The shock was not only about the alleged act, but about its implications: trust, love, and the fragility of family bonds. People wrestled with the horror of the possibility that the one person expected to protect and care could also be the one capable of destruction. That cognitive dissonance, the collision of expectation and reality, was part of what made the case so compelling and so tragic. Nick himself remained largely silent in public, though legal procedures had begun. The first court appearance loomed, and he would soon enter a courtroom under conditions that signaled both concern and danger: the anti-suicide vest, the silent compliance, the limited communication. This combination of factors created a narrative in which the suspect was simultaneously vulnerable, dangerous, and mysterious. Every nuance of behavior, every pause, every gesture would be scrutinized, magnified, and interpreted, often without context. In the early days of the investigation, law enforcement sources provided limited but telling details. They indicated that the focus on Nick was not arbitrary. It was rooted in evidence, access, and behavioral indicators. Yet, at the same time, authorities emphasized that suspicion is not conviction. He was a suspect, and the legal system's role was to discern truth, not to pass judgment prematurely. The delicate balance between procedural fairness and public fascination created an atmosphere of tension that would only intensify as the case unfolded. What made Nick's position particularly precarious was the overlap between private family dynamics and public perception. He was not an anonymous defendant. His name carried weight, recognition, and expectation. Every misstep, every public image, every media portrayal became part of a broader narrative. Unlike an ordinary criminal case, this was a story in which fame itself complicated the legal, emotional, and societal dimensions. The Reiners household, once a private sanctuary, had become a stage for legal drama, media spectacle, and public fascination. As law enforcement built their case, they considered every possible factor: motive, opportunity, behavior, and past interactions. But in the background, the human drama remained central. A family's trust shattered, a neighborhood shocked, a city captivated, and at the center, a son whose life had been defined by family, opportunity, and potential, now standing accused of a crime that defied comprehension. The shift from son to suspect is rarely a single moment. It is a series of events, observations, and suspicions that coalesce into a legal and social narrative. For Nick Reiner, that shift began almost immediately after the discovery of the bodies. Investigators, using a combination of physical evidence, witness interviews, and behavioral analysis, began to place him at the center of the narrative. Each step, each interaction, each decision further embedded him in a story that was as horrifying as it was captivating. The public watched, fascinated by the transformation. Headlines referred to him as the accused son, emphasizing both his identity and the nature of the allegation. Social media debates raged. Discussions on motive, mental state, and family tension dominated conversations. Every day, new details emerged or were speculated upon, and the narrative of a son turned suspect solidified in the public mind. And yet, even with all the speculation and observation, the truth remained elusive. The investigators had access to facts, evidence, and procedural tools. The public had only images, reports, and speculation. The dissonance between these two realities would define the next chapter of this story, as legal proceedings, forensic evidence, and personal testimony slowly began to illuminate a situation that, until now, had been largely defined by assumption and horror. The transformation from son to suspect is both legal and symbolic. It marks the moment when love, trust, and familial bonds are overshadowed by suspicion, scrutiny, and potential criminal liability. For Nick Reiner, that transformation would not only define the investigation, but would shape public perception, media coverage, and the emotional fallout of a family tragedy that had no easy resolution. And as authorities continued to investigate, it became clear that the story of Nick Reiner, the son accused of murdering his parents, was only beginning. The early signs, the initial evidence, and the first moments of suspicion hinted at a narrative far more complex than a single act of violence. Relationships, emotions, access, and opportunity all intertwined, creating a case that would challenge assumptions, provoke debate, and haunt those who followed it closely. The morning had barely begun when chaos silently erupted. In the quiet of Brentwood, behind the walls of a home that had once been a sanctuary, a violent act allegedly occurred that would forever change lives. By the time the bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner were discovered, the narrative had already shifted. Law enforcement sources would later indicate that the person investigators considered most likely to be responsible, Nick Reiner, was no longer at the scene. What followed, investigators say, was a flight, a movement through the city that would become a key component of both the investigation and the public's perception of the case. Flight in the context of a criminal investigation is a complex concept. It can suggest guilt, fear, disorientation, or even panic. It can be rational or irrational, calculated or instinctive. In Nick Reiner's case, the reports indicated that he left the home in the hours following the alleged crime. The circumstances surrounding that departure would become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the investigation. Was it a deliberate attempt to avoid accountability, or was it the panicked response of someone overwhelmed by shock and trauma? Investigators, trained to analyze both action and intent, would consider every possibility. The timeline of the flight became a focal point. Detectives reconstructed the movements based on witness statements, traffic cameras, and cell phone location data. Every mile, every turn, and every stop was logged as part of the official record. According to reports, Nick had been seen in areas near the home shortly after the alleged incident, moving away from the scene. Law enforcement considered this evidence in conjunction with the events inside the house, the timeline of discovery, and the subsequent arrest. In the eyes of authorities, movement away from the scene, particularly by someone with direct access, raised critical questions. Yet, as is often the case, the public narrative quickly diverged from the legal one. Headlines described a flight from justice or escape from the scene, suggesting guilt and intent. Social media amplified these interpretations, often without the context that investigators had painstakingly collected. To the public, the image of Nick leaving the house, his life unraveling, his parents gone, was both dramatic and incriminating. But in the courtroom and in legal procedures, each movement would be carefully examined, each motive meticulously considered, and each interpretation weighed against the standards of evidence. Flight, however, is not solely a physical act. It carries psychological weight. Being accused of a crime, particularly one involving the death of one's parents, produces an emotional and cognitive overload. Fear, confusion, denial, and stress interact in ways that can lead to irrational behavior. Investigators noted these possibilities as they pieced together witness accounts and surveillance footage. The public, however, often interprets such movement simplistically. If someone flees, they must be guilty. And it is this tension, the gap between perception and procedural truth, that heightens the drama surrounding the case. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances recalled that Nick was known to be unpredictable at times. Some described him as introspective, reserved, and prone to sudden emotional shifts. Others spoke of familial tension, of disagreements that were part of the fabric of daily life, but never anticipated to escalate into violence. In retrospect, these recollections became clues, pieces of a puzzle that investigators needed to understand not as judgment, but as context. Each anecdote, each detail, however minor, was scrutinized for insight into mindset, intent, and potential risk factors. The media coverage of Nick's departure from the scene painted a picture of urgency and desperation. Reports described him leaving in a vehicle, moving through parts of Los Angeles that investigators later identified as part of a complex pattern of behavior. Every detail was dissected: the route taken, stops along the way, interactions with others. In legal terms, these details are often critical for establishing intent and reconstructing the narrative of events. In public perception, they became symbols of guilt, adding to the drama and shaping the early story of a son-turned-suspect. What makes Flight especially compelling is the ambiguity it carries. Was Nick attempting to hide, to escape, or merely to process what had just occurred? Did he believe he was being pursued, or was he simply trying to find a safe place? In the minds of investigators, these questions matter immensely because they influence interpretation of actions, assessment of risk, and eventual legal strategy. In the minds of the public, the answers are often assumed rather than analyzed. This dissonance creates tension and fascination, feeding the appetite for drama, speculation, and narrative closure that is rarely simple or forthcoming. For law enforcement, the focus on Flight was both procedural and psychological. They had to trace movement, interview potential witnesses, and recover evidence from vehicles or locations he had visited. The goal was not only to understand physical movement, but also to gain insight into state of mind, emotional response, and potential risk to self or others. Each piece of data, every stop, every deviation from a straight path, was recorded, analyzed, and cross-referenced with forensic evidence from the home. The thoroughness of the investigation reflected the gravity of the allegations and the complexity of assessing human behavior under extreme circumstances. Flight also magnified public scrutiny in unprecedented ways. Media outlets reported on every development, from traffic camera captures to purported sightings. Social media users speculated about motive, mental state, and next steps. Hashtags and trending topics multiplied as people debated guilt and innocence, often without understanding the underlying evidence or procedural constraints. This digital amplification created a feedback loop, intensifying the narrative and shaping public opinion before the legal process had fully unfolded. Yet, behind the headlines, the human dimension persisted. Nick Reiner was a young man grappling with the unimaginable. His parents dead, his life transformed, his every action monitored, recorded, and interpreted. The psychological weight of this reality cannot be overstated. Flight is rarely just about physical movement. It is also a metaphor for attempting to escape overwhelming emotion, fear, and the crushing pressure of scrutiny. And in this context, it becomes both literal and symbolic, a movement through space and a descent into a storm that would only intensify in the coming days. As law enforcement reconstructed the events, each detail of Flight intersected with other aspects of the case. Evidence inside the home, witness testimony, prior behavior, and psychological analysis. Together, these elements began to form a narrative that investigators could work with, one that would eventually inform charges, courtroom strategy, and public understanding. But at this early stage, much remained unknown. The flight, like the crime itself, carried uncertainty, ambiguity, and a haunting sense of inevitability. The narrative of a son allegedly fleeing the scene of his parents' deaths combines elements of tragedy, suspense, and psychological complexity. It challenges assumptions about familial loyalty, emotional resilience, and the capacity for human behavior under stress. And it sets the stage for the courtroom drama that would follow. A scene in which the accused would appear restrained, silent, and profoundly vulnerable, yet at the center of a storm of scrutiny, judgment, and expectation. Investigators emphasize the importance of context. Flight does not automatically imply guilt. It can indicate fear, confusion, or a desperate attempt to process trauma. And in Nick Reiner's case, it also intersected with public perception, media sensationalism, and the broader narrative of Hollywood tragedy. Understanding the flight, both literally and metaphorically, became critical to understanding the case itself, a story of privilege, opportunity, familial conflict, and the human capacity for behavior that defies expectation. The hours following Nick Reiner's alleged flight from the Brentwood home were tense, chaotic, and filled with a strange mixture of procedural precision and public frenzy. 3 days would pass between the discovery of his parents' bodies and his first court appearance. A period during which law enforcement, legal teams, and the media each played distinct but interconnected roles. Those 3 days were not just about logistics. They were about narrative formation, emotional intensity, and the mounting anticipation of a courtroom drama that would captivate a city and the world. From the moment Nick was taken into custody, law enforcement focused on two critical priorities: securing him safely and preserving evidence. The blue anti-suicide smock he would later wear in court was a response to concerns about his mental and emotional state. The presence of law enforcement personnel, the protocols for moving him between holding facilities, and the careful documentation of his condition were all part of a meticulous process designed to maintain order and prevent further tragedy. Every detail of his detention, the timing, the interactions, the monitoring, was recorded and would later become relevant to both prosecutors and defense teams. During this period, investigators worked tirelessly to analyze the evidence gathered at the Brentwood home. Forensic teams combed through every room, every surface, and every item, documenting, cataloging, and securing anything that could shed light on what had occurred. Fingerprints, DNA, blood spatter patterns, and other physical evidence were carefully examined, cross-referenced, and prepared for eventual presentation in court. This process was painstaking, but necessary. In cases involving familial homicide, the smallest detail can provide the critical connection between suspect, victim, and alleged crime. Meanwhile, legal teams were mobilized. For someone of Nick Reiner's public profile, the stakes were not only criminal, but also reputational and procedural. Defense attorneys, often working under extreme time pressure, began strategizing on how to approach the case, including considerations about mental health evaluations, plea options, and media management. The prosecution, in parallel, assessed the evidence and prepared initial motions, ensuring that every aspect of procedure adhered to legal standards while anticipating the complex questions that would arise in court. These 3 days were, in effect, the calm before the storm, filled with preparation, assessment, and the weight of what was to come. The public, however, was not privy to most of these procedural details. Instead, they received a steady stream of media reports, images, and speculation. Every movement, every decision, and every reported observation became a point of discussion and judgment. The narrative began to crystallize. Nick Reiner, a young man once defined by privilege, was now an accused murderer. The court date was imminent, and with it, the world would see the first public acknowledgement of the allegations. Headlines were relentless, social media posts multiplied, and the combination of celebrity, tragedy, and mystery created a sense of anticipation that was almost unbearable. Within this context, Nick's own experience was fraught with complexity. 3 days of detention, isolation, and preparation for public scrutiny can have profound psychological effects. Reports suggested he was largely silent, contemplative, and emotionally strained, a man grappling with the enormity of what had allegedly occurred and the consequences he faced. The blue anti-suicide vest was more than a safety precaution. It was a visible symbol of vulnerability, a signal to the world that this was a person under extraordinary pressure. For observers, the image of Nick in that vest, restrained yet presentable for court, would become iconic. A representation of both fragility and potential danger. During this period, investigators also began piecing together the timeline more precisely. Witnesses were interviewed, surveillance footage reviewed, and minor inconsistencies analyzed. Each piece of information added a layer of understanding or confusion about the alleged events. What did Nick do immediately after leaving the house? Did he attempt to contact anyone? Did he show signs of remorse, fear, or premeditation? These questions became central to both the legal case and the public narrative. The answers were critical, but at this stage, much remained uncertain. Social media, unsurprisingly, played a parallel role in shaping perception. Users speculated about motive, mental state, and next steps. Some assumed guilt, others floated theories of innocence or misidentification. Hashtags trended, discussion forums filled with analysis, and the media amplified every rumor and unverified detail. In this digital landscape, the court of public opinion formed quickly and often harshly, judging behavior and intent before any formal evidence was presented. This dynamic created pressure on legal teams, investigators, and even the suspect, who now faced both formal prosecution and the relentless gaze of global scrutiny. Family, friends, and acquaintances, meanwhile, were caught in the emotional crossfire. The Reiner family had been admired for decades, known for their contributions to film, photography, and culture. To reconcile the image of the family they knew with the allegations against Nick was profoundly difficult. Private grief, public speculation, and the tension between belief and disbelief created a complex emotional landscape that extended beyond the courtroom. These 3 days were a period of mourning, confusion, and anticipation as friends and colleagues struggled to process the news while awaiting the first legal appearance. By the end of the third day, all procedural elements had been aligned for the court appearance. Nick would be transported under strict supervision, his appearance carefully managed to balance safety, security, and public transparency. The media had assembled, cameras poised, reporters ready, and the public eager for a glimpse of the accused. The tension in Los Angeles was palpable. Even casual observers sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. It was more than a legal proceeding. It was the opening of a public chapter in a story that combined familial tragedy, celebrity, and the human fascination with the extremes of behavior. The 3 days leading to court were a concentrated period in which every action, decision, and observation contributed to the narrative that would dominate headlines for months. The preparation was both practical and symbolic, reflecting the intersection of law, psychology, and society's relentless curiosity. And for Nick Reiner, the transition from detention to courtroom was a journey of exposure, vulnerability, and scrutiny. Every step taken toward the court, every glance caught by cameras, and every procedural compliance signaled a shift from private torment to public theater. The 3 days had been a prelude, a build-up, and a testing ground for what would become a defining moment in both legal history and cultural consciousness. The doors of the Los Angeles courtroom swung open, and for the first time since his arrest, Nick Reiner stepped into public view. The anticipation inside the room was nearly tangible, a tension that vibrated in every corner. Journalists, law enforcement, family representatives, and a smattering of curious onlookers held their breath. All eyes were on him, the son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the accused in one of Hollywood's most shocking alleged crimes. Nick's appearance was stark, almost cinematic in its intensity. He was wearing a blue anti-suicide smock, a garment that immediately conveyed both vulnerability and danger. His beard and unkempt hair framed a face drawn tight with exhaustion and strain. His eyes, shadowed and heavy, moved cautiously, scanning the room yet avoiding direct contact. There was a visible tension in his posture, a subtle tremor in his movements, as if the weight of the allegations and the attention of the world pressed on him physically. The courtroom itself was a theater of contrasts. Legal professionals moved with deliberate calm, their motions precise and measured. Reporters, notepads in hand, scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. Cameras clicked intermittently, flashes punctuating the otherwise somber environment. For the observers, the scene was electric. For Nick, it was suffocating. Every breath, every gesture, every blink became a statement, a potential clue, or fodder for speculation. The initial moments of the arraignment were procedural. The judge, a figure of authority and solemnity, called Nick's name. He responded, almost mechanically, with "Yes, Your Honor," confirming the date for his next appearance. That was all. No plea, no defense, no explanation. 6 words that carried the weight of the world. Silence then reclaimed the room, a silence that was both eerie and charged with anticipation. What made this moment so shocking was the convergence of personal tragedy and public spectacle. Here was a man accused of killing his parents. 2 individuals well-loved in both private and public spheres, standing visibly restrained, protected, and under intense observation. The image of Nick in a blue vest, speaking only once to comply with procedure, created a striking dichotomy. A son in extreme vulnerability accused of the most extreme betrayal. For those in attendance, the courtroom revealed more than just a procedural formality. It revealed the emotional and psychological dimensions of the accused. Nick's silence, posture, and attire all communicated a story that words alone could not. It was a study in contrasts, fragility and potential danger, shame and defiance, grief and detachment. Observers could not help but wonder what he was thinking, what he was feeling, and how he would navigate the labyrinth of legal proceedings that lay ahead. Media coverage exploded immediately. Images of Nick, vest-clad and solemn, were broadcast across news outlets and social media. Analysts dissected every detail, the angle of his head, the tension in his shoulders, the silence that hung like a fog around him. Speculation about mental health, premeditation, and emotional states spread rapidly. often with little verified information to support the theories. The public, captivated and horrified, formed opinions that would influence perception long before any legal verdict could be reached. Inside the courtroom, procedural necessity dictated order. Lawyers clarified charges, the judge outlined the next steps, and court officers maintained a controlled environment. Yet beneath the formalities, a psychological drama unfolded. How does one reconcile the image of a son standing accused with the reality of his parents' deaths? How does the legal system manage both the needs of justice and the complexities of human behavior under extreme stress? These questions, unspoken yet omnipresent, hung over the proceedings like a dark cloud. Observers also noted the subtle ways in which Nick communicated without words. A shift of weight, a brief glance, the way he held his hands, all became points of analysis. In cases involving public figures, the smallest gestures are magnified, interpreted as signs of guilt, innocence, or emotional state. For the accused, this scrutiny adds an additional layer of pressure, intensifying the already overwhelming weight of the legal and emotional stakes. The arraignment, though brief, set the tone for what was to come. It marked Nick's formal introduction to the judicial process, the first public acknowledgement of the allegations against him, and the initial framing of a narrative that would dominate headlines and public discourse. The procedural simplicity, confirming a court date, acknowledging charges, belied the emotional, social, and psychological complexity of the situation. Outside the courtroom, the story spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with debate, analysis, and speculation. News outlets circulated photographs and video footage, dissecting every detail. The public, hungry for understanding and captivated by the contrast between fame and alleged violence, engaged in a collective effort to interpret, judge, and predict. The narrative of a son standing accused of murdering his parents became both a cautionary tale and a spectacle, blurring the lines between tragedy and entertainment. But amid the public scrutiny, the human tragedy remained stark. Rob and Michelle Reiner were gone. Their lives, their contributions, and their relationships were irrevocably altered. The accused, their own son, faced the full force of legal scrutiny and public judgment. The image of Nick in court, vulnerable yet central to a storm of attention, symbolized the collapse of a family unit under extraordinary circumstances. And as the arraignment concluded and Nick was escorted from the courtroom, observers were left with more questions than answers. What drove the alleged actions? What would the investigation uncover next? How would the courtroom drama evolve? And what new revelations would emerge? The first public glimpse of the accused had set the stage, but the story was only beginning.